totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Find the podcast online at bookedonrock.com. You can watch every episode on YouTube at Booked on Rock and listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts like Apple, Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube Music, and more. If you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe and give it a 5-star review wherever you listen. Don Klees is in the guest seat this episode. He's got a new book out, part of Sonicbond Publishing's on-track series titled David Bowie, 1983 to 2016. Every album, every song. In a career full of twists and turns, none was as sharp as the one David Bowie experienced after his 1983 album, Let's Dance. The record gave Bowie the hit that he wanted, but completely altered his artistic standing in the process. Instead of an innovator who pushed rock music forward, the singer found himself a global superstar with a mass audience whose tastes he didn't understand, and who reciprocated this feeling as the 1980s unfolded. After immersing himself in the band project Tin Machine, Bowie spent the 1990s embracing reinvention and experimentation with mixed but often fascinating results, leading to a full-fledged renaissance early in the 21st century. From there, his story only got stranger. 2013's The Next Day was a triumphant comeback after years of self-imposed silence, while 2016's Blackstar stood among his most challenging albums and became the final release of his lifetime. Find a playlist of David Bowie 1983 to 2016 in this episode's show notes. Hi, Don. Welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you.
Thank you so much. Good to meet you as well. And thank you for having me. I've been working on this book for 2 years, for the better part of 2 years, and it feels real now. And it's actually nice to talk about someone other than my family who are sick of hearing it by now.
Yeah, well, quite a daunting task for you. 1983 to 2016. It's a long period. What led you to writing the book?
There's this great Bob Dylan lyric that goes something like, "If I'd thought about it, I never would have done it," because it really was a very daunting task to take on. I think I started out with much smaller ambitions. I'd written a couple books for Sonicbond before, part of their Decades series. Wrote one about Bob Dylan in the 80s, as well as one about Fleetwood Mac and their members in the 80s. And I thought, maybe one about Bowie, focusing on his 1990s work, because that's kind of like sort of the real kind of weird under the radar period where it didn't have the big kind of successful albums that the 80s did. And it was between them and that kind of renaissance that he had in the early 2000s with albums like Heathen. So to me, that was like, hey, that's a period that really should be explored. But the Stephen, the publisher at Sonicbond, who's been incredibly supportive in all 3 books that I've done for them now, he wanted something to go for their On Track series because they already had a book that was going to focus on those sort of, pardon the cliche, golden years of Bowie's career, that kind of 1970s period that really kind of made his reputation. And so, my book was going to be the sequel to that, focusing on the period that was both some of his most popular work as well as some of his, shall we say, less respected work. And I think that was stuff because it coincided with when I became a fan of Bowie, because I sort of lived it in real time, if you know what I mean. I felt like that was something I could really approach with a sense of purpose, about really finding kind of recognizing where there are shortcomings and things that didn't really land, but also I think coming at it with a perspective of, yeah, there's maybe a lot more here than people give credit to.
Interesting comment in the introduction I want to ask you about, and it's about the music that Bowie put out during this time. And you state that the music he put out during this time served as artful reminders of the distinction between works of genius and the work of a genius. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I think when we talk about someone as a genius, and I think everyone but the harshest detractors would probably agree the word genius is a fair assessment of Bowie as an artist. But I think sometimes we get so hung up on this idea that if something is a genius, work of genius, it's perfect, it's absolutely brilliant, it's unimpeachable. And the truth is with Bowie, that's often not the case, because I think he had this willingness to get it wrong. I think a lot of times he went into projects not exactly knowing where he was going to end up. And I think there's just something really amazing about that. I mean, look, I love Paul McCartney, for example. It's probably uncool to say this. Paul's my favorite Beatle. He's the master craftsman of those four people. And I absolutely respect that craft because that's been much of the soundtrack of my life. Where I love someone like Bowie or Dylan for that matter is that they had this willingness to, again, get it wrong sometimes, to see where the idea took them. And yeah, it didn't always land. And I think that's where, and that's, I think, some of the fun of some of Bowie's later work, seeing that there was still this incredible driven artist at work here, and one who realized that, success and failure were, kind of relative terms, and, that you could actually, that sometimes you should get hung up on, is this perfect or anything like that. You should just make the best, what sounds best to you, and let the audience decide, because they're going to do that anyway. We as fans, there's no harsher critic than a fan. No one will love the work more. No one will find more shortcomings than a fan. And
would you say he was fearless when it came to taking risks? Like, he wasn't afraid to be criticized?
I think the only times that he maybe truly misstepped was when he second guessed himself as to that kind of fearlessness. Where I think where he maybe not settled is maybe the wrong word, but I think sometimes where he said, well, you know what, I'll go down this path that I think will be successful, where maybe he should have taken more risks. I think that's maybe where sometimes if he made missteps, it was in maybe not being bold enough in some cases.
From reading this book, I'm a novice Bowie fan. I am a fan, but not an expert fan like yourself. But it does seem like he was always looking for that youthful inspiration. He never seemed to get bored, only because he intentionally looked for things, avenues, places to go, like Tin Machine, that would inspire him and keep him youthful as an artist.
Absolutely. He would champion, bands like in the late 80s. He was out there championing bands like Sonic Youth, the Pixies, who many, those groups and many others like Nirvana after them had those big popular breakthroughs. But Bowie was, maybe unique among artists of his kind of stature, of saying, hey, this is the music you should be listening to. These are the bands that are pushing the boundaries. So yeah, he was definitely drawing inspiration. And when you read interviews with his collaborators over the years, and and the picture you get, there is someone who, they never ceased being open to new and different sounds, who was always just interested in how music was developing, who was willing to serve as a sort of unpretentious mentor to younger artists and so on. And it's and I do think that is part of what's so special about him.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
When patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Before we get into the albums and the songs, the book is broken down into sections comprised of specific time periods.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, and also why you decided to start with the year 1983, not instead of just starting with 1980? Maybe start with the 80s and go forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it was a kind of a pragmatic aspect of, that because Sonicbond did have a book in mind that was going to cover up through that kind of 1980 period with Scary Monsters. And hey, look, and Scary Monsters is one of my absolute favorite Bowie albums.
That might be my favorite.
Yeah, I mean,
album.
It's a fantastic album. And so it's one, look, I would have loved to have written about that, but again, they had a book in mind, and I think that Let's Dance is sort of a natural turning point, demarcation point, because it was this immense popular breakthrough, and I think because it is the album that really it did change everything about his career. It's hard to imagine Bowie's work without Let's Dance there. As much as some fans may wish, oh my God, I wish he'd never, run into Nile Rodgers in that New York club in, the early 80s. it's there, and it is that album that had this great impact. And not all of that impact is great. But yeah, it was the album that really just kind of set off this very different path for him. So it was a great place it was a great starting point. I mean, I cheat a little bit because I do talk about some things like his collaboration with Queen on the song Under Pressure that kind of led up to that. So, but yeah, I think that period was it was a good and interesting place to start. And you know what, honestly, on a very personal level, I mean, even though I was certainly aware of David Bowie and knew kind of, again, knew him by reputation and everything, but I mean, that was sort of the first album of his that really kind of came out in my kind of music buying years, like that was the first one where those songs were on the radio and they were brand new, and just kind of, where that saxophone solo in Modern Love just kind of was like, whoa, So for me, kind of personally, that was the time I became a fan. And like I said, I lived it in real time a little bit. And so I've kind of, again, I processed all those albums, even as I went back and came to understand the Berlin trilogy and Ziggy Stardust, which is, I mean, I like, again, I can't even, begin to talk about how much that album just opened my ears and my mind. It's like, the number of things that have had the same impact on me is very small. It's like, Ziggy Stardust, the original Star Wars, and the Wim Wenders movie Wings of Desire. And I'm not sure what else had that same kind of, just absolutely changed my way of thinking.
Yeah, I became a fan through Let's Dance, 1983. Yeah. Huge album.
Yeah. There's a tendency to want to apologize for it or something, but why? It's like, it's a hell of an album. It's am I saying it's as good as Scary Monsters? No, but it's still, and the important thing about this is, what? It's the album he wanted to make. And that's like, I think, a recurring theme for me in this book. Bowie wanted to make these albums. Like he, well, so you could argue whether he really wanted to make Tonight, but he went into a lot of these records, all, with very few exceptions, with an idea of what he wanted to do. And by and large, what was released was, reflected what he wanted to do, win or lose, succeed or fail.
As a fan, that's what's most important, is if it's what the artist wanted to do, whether it's commercial or something really off the beaten path, as long as it's something they wanted to do, that's cool. And that's what it was, Let's Dance. It's not a hit album by accident.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
In fact, Bowie told Nile Rodgers, the producer, he said, quote, "I want you to make a hit." And Nile was surprised by this. He was thinking maybe avant-garde jazz. That's maybe what Bowie was going to come to him with. But talk about the picture that Bowie showed Nile Rodgers of Little Richard and why he showed him that particular photo.
Yeah, it was a really interesting thing, because I think that the story goes, according to Nile Rodgers, who he said that to kind of convey the sort of record that Bowie wanted to make, because look, Nile Rodgers, for just for those who don't know, I mean, he was one of the most successful artists, producers of the kind of late 70s and early 80s, with Chic, as well as his work with other artists, Diana Ross and a ton of others. But because Chic was associated with disco, and disco was sort of, considered the enemy of good music by a lot of people, he kind of got a bad rap. And I think he saw Bowie, working with Bowie, as a way to maybe be taken more seriously. And I think he was taken aback when Bowie said, "No, I really want to kind of channel your sensibilities, work with you, get your sensibilities to come up with this." Really, I think the key word is timeless sort of record. So he showed them this picture of Little Richard by a Cadillac, and he said, "I want you to make an album for me that sounds like this picture looks." I'm paraphrasing there. And the way Rodgers talked about it, he said, he realized that, he talked about how the picture, could have been from the future, but he knew it was something from the past. And in that moment, he realized that what Bowie wanted to make with him was an album that, if it came out, someone listening to it, years from then, would think, this just sounds absolutely kind of timeless. Like it's contemporary, just, not some kind of period piece or anything, but just a great kind of pop album. And they did it.
Yeah. He knocked it out of the park.
Yeah.
Knocked it. He had Modern Love number 14, China Girl number 10, title track number 1. So 3 huge hit singles and
absolutely
MTV videos. And he brought in a relatively unknown Stevie Ray Vaughan to play guitar.
Yep.
I mean, Stevie Ray was known maybe in small circles among the music community, but this was his big break. But it's interesting that he was to be on that tour, but Stevie's management and Bowie's management couldn't agree on a deal to have him on that tour.
This is one of those things that, that I think there are probably more versions of the story of, like, just certain things in Bowie's life and his work just have, I think there's a lot of kind of conflicting narratives and speculation about, what really happened. I mean, there are some people who say it was a salary dispute. Some people felt there were, kind of personal issues, maybe things involving substances. It's hard to say. I'm always, writing a book like this, you don't want to get too gossipy, kind of step back from that a little bit. But at the end of the day, the tour didn't happen with Stevie Ray Vaughan, which is unfortunate because his playing on the album is fantastic. And it would have been the guitarist who went on the tour in place of Stevie Ray Vaughan is this guy named Earl Slick, who did he would toured and played on Bowie albums before, who then would actually then come back kind of into the fold with Bowie many years later. So he's someone who very much kind of Bowie was familiar with, who knew a lot of different aspects of Bowie's song, and did a great job. It would have been really fascinating to hear what a more blues focused player like Stevie Ray Vaughan would have brought to some of the other songs from Bowie's past that he played on the Serious Moonlight tour. I mean,
right. Yeah. How that would have sounded.
Imagining a song like Heroes, or, some of the really kind of, more, I'm not even sure how you describe a song like Station to Station, but,
right.
But some of these really just kind of very kind of heavy pieces. And I think Vaughan's playing would have brought an interesting thing to it. Something I don't go into this a lot in the book because it really is more about the albums and the recorded work. But I think Bowie is one of those artists, and since his passing, a lot more live recordings have come out, and it is fascinating to hear how his live recordings differ from the studio versions and so on. And again, I think with Vaughan, it would have been you would have gotten some really, I think, amazing and distinctive versions of some of those classic songs.
I always thought it was cool just how Stevie Ray plays these songs, knowing later when he's recording and live, just unleashing his skills, just on fire. But in these songs, he's playing within the structure of the song. So he had that ability to pull back, which I thought
exactly.
that's really impressive about Stevie Ray, that he was able to do that.
Yeah, because I think when you talk about virtuosos, that's sometimes they become known, rightly or wrongly, as people who can't stop themselves, who try to take over the song. And when you realize the control and the, just the, restraint that he demonstrated to complement those songs is, I think, that really is, I think, one of those marks of a great musician. I mean, he could, and when you've heard him let loose, it's like, it's not that he couldn't do it. It was, he, I think he and look, obviously, David Bowie and Nile Rodgers, but each of them is going to have really strong feelings about how a song should sound. So I'm sure he was getting a lot of direction about how to play and what to do, but it never feels forced. It feels like
right. Because if he didn't pull it off, they would have probably said, "Sorry, man, this ain't happening."
I think multi-track recording can be very unforgiving for for sidemen.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
The entry on Let's Dance is interesting. Talk about how the song started and was completed with Nile Rodgers' input. A couple things that stood out to me. Started out as a folky piece, and then there's a connection to the TV series Peter Gunn in the song.
Yeah. So there's a great documentary for Bowie fans that I highly recommend seeking out if you can. It was done by the BBC about 2013, and I think sometimes it's been on PBS and other places. It's called 5 Years, and looked at sort of some key points in Bowie's career. And one of the years they look at is 1983, when he was making Let's Dance, or really kind of 1982 into 1983. And Nile Rodgers, they had Nile Rodgers on camera, because that by this point, Bowie wasn't really giving interviews. He'd become a much more private person by the time this documentary was being done in 2013. But Rodgers talks about how when he's working with Bowie at his kind of like home studio thing in like Switzerland or wherever, like near his ski chalet and all that, because he was a very wealthy man. Even before Let's Dance, he was still he was living a comfortable life. Forget Austin Powers, he's the real international man of mystery. So Rodgers talked in this documentary about Bowie presented the song to him, and again, this very folky piece, the same lyrics, you know from that song, but again, presented in a very folky manner, just he's strumming it on the guitar. A very striking thing Rodgers mentions is it was a 12-string guitar, but for some reason he only had 6 strings in it, for whatever reason. And at first, when Rodgers, when Bowie tells Rodgers that he thinks this song could be a hit, Rodgers, who is probably feeling a little bit uncertain, because again, he thought he was maybe going to be doing something a little bit more adventurous, or what he would have perceived as adventurous, and he's being told, no, I want to make a hit. Then Bowie comes to him with this sort of folky piece, and he's thinking, wait, is he testing me? And so he's not sure what to do. He calls some people who he knows who are also friends with Bowie. They kind of reassure him, look, if he tells you that it could be a hit, he really believes it. So Rodgers thinks, all right, how do I approach this? And so he kind of goes back, looks at the chords to go with the song that Bowie wrote, plays around with them to kind of keep the essence of the melody, but maybe give them a little more oomph. And he decides, he brings in some musicians to the studio in Switzerland, has them record a demo of the song, because he kind of wants to see, does this approach work? Can it really work? So he brings in these people, but the kicker is, for Bowie, he says, no, David, sing the lyrics the way you did when you played that on that guitar for me. Because Rodgers' rationale kind of breaks down as, look, he thought they were going to be a hit that way. Let's kind of keep that and see where it's going. And Rodgers, like he recounts in the liner notes to a collection of albums and other records from that time, that kind of when he heard that demo and he heard the people playing, he realized, yes, this will work. This approach is what will work for the album. And so and then, so they kind of recorded the rest of the album in that style. When they do the full on recording at that point, they're no longer in Switzerland, they're back in New York, but they added the horns. The horn part, Rodgers kind of admits, they sort of nicked some aspects of that from the theme to the TV show Peter Gunn, and it was one of those things where, and like Rodgers and Bowie were both kind of, had that kind of background and loved those classic TV show themes, a lot of them with that more jazz aspect to them. There's a great interview out there with Rodgers where he talks about how he was a little bit nervous about kind of appropriating something like that so openly, but he said Bowie told him it was okay. It was postmodernistic in reinterpretation. So but again, it was this, but that song, Let's Dance, it really is this amazing fusion of a lot of different aspects. So of course, you've got those real danceable sensibilities that Rodgers brought to it from his work with Chic. You had this, lyrical sensibility from Bowie's part, the blues influence Stevie Ray Vaughan's giving, this whole other approach to like the horn parts and everything. And it was, it was in its way, it's not my favorite song on the album, but it's a damn near perfect pop song.
What's your favorite?
I would have to say my favorite is Modern Love.
Same here.
That's the one that just caught my ear. And again, that saxophone solo, I'm a sucker for a great saxophone solo.
Yeah, it's undeniable. Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Come out wherever you are.
Now, what's interesting is how he responds to that success. The following albums are 1984's Tonight, which has the hit single Blue Jean, which was his fifth and final top 10 single. Then he does soundtrack and charity projects in 1985 and 1986. The cover of Dancing in the Street with Mick Jagger in 85, number 7 single. Also did the music for the film Labyrinth in 86, followed by 1987's Never Let Me Down. What was Bowie's response to the overwhelming commercial success of Let's Dance? You point out that he experienced a disconnect from his newly expanded audience. So what changes, if any, did he make as a result?
Well, Bowie had been, I think we would have considered him a star, kind of by any kind of reasonable measure, in the early 80s, pre Let's Dance. He was someone, if he toured, he could play, he could play maybe not the biggest of big venues, maybe not sell out stadiums, but he could sell out multiple nights at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. He had, a strong fan base kind of with him, thick or thin. He was that really kind of known person, respected artist. And Let's Dance really did change that. It made him, kind of that kind of globally known superstar. He was all over MTV, which, and that this was kind of when MTV was at the height of its sort of cultural significance. But I think Bowie was maybe not comfortable with that because because he had, he had sort of followed his instincts artistically into some, pretty esoteric areas. When you listen to some of those albums that he collaborated on songwriting with Brian Eno, like Low and Heroes, for instance, or, Scary Monsters, which is a great album, but it's an incredibly dark one too. So I think he was, but the famous quote from Bowie, there's a famous quote from Bowie about how he would look out into the audience at the shows, during the Serious Moonlight tour and wonder how many of these people had any Velvet Underground albums in their collection. Like he recognized that, that whereas maybe the audience that had been with him for the previous years had now been kind of augmented by an audience that maybe didn't have those same sensibilities and kind of same interest in, in maybe again more, adventurous music. I'm not trying to knock anyone's taste here because I'm a firm believer that people should like what they want to like. I'm not trying to be, snobbish or anything, but because Let's Dance was so successful, his record company, they were pushing him for a follow-up immediately. And so he probably went back in the studio to do the album Tonight much too quickly because he's always said in interviews that he could never really write well on tour. So he didn't have much in the way of new songs. So much of the album at least, is either other people's songs or in some cases like some songs he had that he had previously written and recorded with Iggy Pop, years earlier when they were working together in the 70s. So you have this album Tonight, which ended up selling really well. It had a really big hit in the form of Blue Jean. It also had, some stuff that is, not so good. His cover of the Beach Boys song "God Only Knows" is not great. To be honest, I don't want to, dwell on that one because I always feel like that particular track has become a little bit of a punching bag when people are trying to kind of knock Bowie's 80s albums. But it was a very, the album was really very much of a hodgepodge, like it's one of those things where like if he had just said maybe either wait to do an album until I've got enough good new songs or do like a covers album, kind of like his 70s record Pinups or something, maybe it would have been a different situation. As it was, you had this thing that didn't quite feel like a real kind of considered album, but despite having some really great stuff on it, he later was very like he himself was very down on the album. He referred to Tonight as a quote desperate mistake, which of course, speaking to someone who can recognize all kinds of shortcomings in that album, I will say I think there are a great many artists who wish their desperate mistakes had that much good stuff on it.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Like the song "Loving the Alien," which is still one of his most incredible just striking songs. Like that's, again, a lot of people say Tonight is his worst album, but it's got one of his absolute best songs ever.
And from a commercial standpoint, at least the record label was happy that Blue Jean was on there. That could have easily have wound up on Let's Dance.
Mm-hmm.
But you say what made it the focal point to the album was not just its success as a single, but also the short film Jazzin' for Blue Jean.
Yep.
Talk about that film project.
Yeah, well, Bowie had been acting, he started taking on roles in movies, kind of going back into the 70s. And he was really very much a pioneer in music videos. You go back and you look at some of the things like the video for Ashes to Ashes, which is technically primitive perhaps, but one of the most haunting things you'll ever see in the music video form. He seemed to want to really push the bounds of what the music video form could do now that MTV was out there. So, he devised this short film, it's about 20 minutes long or so. He did it with director Julian Temple, who, later went on to do various feature films. And, it's a very simple story about a guy who, trying to get a date with a girl. He kind of sneaks his way in by claiming to know this big rock star. Bowie's character does. The twist, of course, is that both the rock star screaming Lord Byron and the sort of hapless, guy, both played by Bowie, so he's got the dual role in there. And it's a really fun, kind of charming piece, a very easygoing piece that was all over MTV in kind of the fall of 1984. I mean, I would certainly stop what I was doing and watch it when it came on. And it really kind of was a nexus of Bowie's ambitions as an actor and also his ambitions as, to really kind of push music video forward. And it's, it's a lot of fun. Is it high art? No, but again, it's a lot of fun. And you really, kind of understand that, look, again, even if he wasn't totally comfortable with this, pop star kind of role, I don't think, that whole period, that whole kind of mid 80s period where a lot of people are very down on the work he put out, man, there's one thing you cannot fault him for, which is work ethic, because he worked his ass off during that mid 80s period. I mean, between Tonight in 1984 and Never Let Me Down in 1987, he did a bunch of stuff for soundtracks and other stuff. And that was like a whole other album worth of stuff that he did in that time frame. He was very, again, just kind of tireless in just, in doing his work and pushing himself in his own way. I think, and I think it's kind of funny because in some cases, sometimes the songs, the sort of one-off things done for soundtracks or whatever, in some cases, and more than a few cases, ended up being maybe better than some of what he ended up, releasing on the full-length albums. Certainly, he himself seemed to have maybe more affection for things like the title song from Absolute Beginners when you get kind of later in his career.
If it wasn't for Queen's performance at Live Aid, Bowie's performance may have been the highlight. Well, U2.
Yeah, I mean, it's
top 3 performances.
Oh yeah, I think Bowie's set was amazing. I didn't actually, I was in a car while that was going on, so I didn't get to see it until after the fact. But just hearing it on the radio, and especially when you got to Heroes, I mean, it's amazing. I still think that's the best performance of Heroes out there. And Bowie was, it's very interesting. I read Bob Geldof's autobiography, many years ago, and he, talked a lot about Bowie's involvement, and a lot of people give Bowie credit for kind of coming on board to agree to perform at Live Aid as early, because I think a lot of other acts were maybe worried, oh, is this being put together too quickly? Is this going to be a fiasco? But once Bowie said, oh yeah, I'm doing it, it seemed to, I guess it gave a lot of other artists a comfort level that this was a credible event. And one of the things I talk about, is that, as I think it's a, reason that I think I've something I've always kind of respected Bowie for, every or pretty much all the artists, like all the primary artists, got 17 minutes to do their performances at Live Aid, not a minute more, not a minute less. And, so Bowie had time to do 5 songs, he only did 4. The reason he only did 4 is because there was a video that's done by the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that was kind of spotlighting the famine in Ethiopia, which of course was what kind of drove Live Aid in the first place. But the show was so tightly scheduled, there was no time to show it unless somebody gave up a song. So Bowie's like, I'll give up one of my songs, because he wanted, this piece to be known, because he felt it was important to have people.
Which song was it, by the way? Which song was he going
to? Supposedly, it was going to be the song 5 Years from Ziggy Stardust.
Okay.
That's not definitive, but like I've seen from at least, but seemed to, what I would say are probably credible sources, that was probably the song he was thinking of doing.
Yeah.
It's very funny, Bowie in his speech before Heroes, he talks about, he thanks the band, which was this great one-off band. I mean, like, how impressive is it when your one-off band features Thomas Dolby as your keyboard player?
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
And he thanks him for getting together to do the show with him. And it was, I think, a case of, they really had very little time to rehearse, because, that at the time, Bowie was in London, he was doing, I can't remember if it was Absolute Beginners or Labyrinth that he was doing at the time, but he was, again, a very busy guy at that point.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Don't go away, gentlemen. We may need all of you.
The story on Dancing in the Street, initially that was going to be a live transatlantic duet with Mick, but they couldn't do it, so that's why we get the recorded version.
Yeah, not necessarily that song. I think they'd had this idea, and I guess you kind of see some aspects of this in things like, Phil Collins, taking the Concorde over to perform at London and then Philadelphia. Like, they wanted to do something to kind of unite the London and the Philadelphia portions. And, they thought maybe there was something they could have, Bowie in London, Mick Jagger in Philadelphia. But, I guess with the satellites, there was like a delay, and they just couldn't figure out a way to make the technology work. And, where either of them could like hear each other or have any idea if they were even remotely in sync with each other. So they decided to record the cover version of the Motown song Dancing in the Streets, which is, in retrospect, coming up on 40 years later, is it a little cheesy? Yes. Is it either Bowie or Mick Jagger's finest hour? No. But you know what? It raised a lot of money to help people. And so there's a lot worse things in this world than that song,
What are your thoughts on his film work in the mid-'80s? It seemed like he was serious about pursuing it long term. Yeah,
I think you're right. And I think it's very striking, because you really do have some, extreme, I guess you could really say extremes, because on the one hand, he was happy to take on a role like Cherith the Goblin King in Labyrinth, which, when you consider both that aspect of a starring role and doing all the songs, like, I feel like that was kind of like, if he was ever going to become that sort of all around multimedia entertainer type, of which I guess Frank Sinatra is maybe the only kind of other analog I can come up with right now, it would have been with that. Like, if Labyrinth had been a huge hit, again, who knows what direction he might have gone in. It was probably more on brand that it was more of a cult classic, when you get down to it. But, then on the flip side, he was also very comfortable taking on a small part in a, shall we say, difficult movie like Last Temptation of Christ, where he plays Pontius Pilate again. And it's very funny, because I'm probably one of the 10 people who saw Last Temptation of Christ in the movie theaters. And that moment where you hear that voice late in the movie, and it's like, whoa, it's like David Bowie and Willem Dafoe, Pontius Pilate and Jesus in the same movie. It's like, that's probably one of the most crazy but also super compelling things.
Sure. Worth the price of admission.
It was, yeah. I mean, it was, yeah. Look, and and obviously, he kept acting, maybe not as consistently as maybe he wanted to, but yeah, I think, look, when he did some genuinely good stuff in that role. I don't think he was. I think the fact that he ended up ultimately doing relatively few movies is not a sign that he was in any way dilettanting there. I think it was just, I think he took the opportunities for things that interested him. And if it didn't interest him, he would just say, pass.
Interesting time period. You had Mick doing some movies, Mick Jagger, and then Sting in
Absolutely.
Dune. It was like the thing at the time in the mid 80s. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's also a side effect of the music video aspect. I think in that period, it did really blur the lines a bit, especially when some of the videos were very narrative in their presentation. I think it made someone like Sting realize, yeah, I think this is something I can do.
Sure.
And to his Sting also, in Dune, in The Bride, and and other things, yeah, Brimstone and Treacle for that matter.
Never Let Me Down. It did feature the single Day In, Day Out, which hit number 17 in the UK, top 40, several other countries. Peter Frampton on guitar.
Yeah.
And you didn't hear this album talk about much, if at all, when talking about David Bowie's body of work. You say it marked the de facto end of his pop star phase. A good end, in your opinion, or is there a good reason as to why it's kind of not talked about?
I would mildly disagree about the aspect of it not being talked about. It's to say that when it is talked about, it's generally talked about in disparaging terms.
Yeah.
Again, that was one of the, I bought that album in real time, and I am not ashamed to say it is an album I have great fondness for. Again, it was still at that point where he was perceived as the sort of MTV star. I think it sold well as a result, got, again, a couple good solid top 40 hits as a result, songs that were definitely very present on MTV, for example. But it's funny though, because underneath it all, when you read interviews with Bowie from that time, he didn't necessarily see it as sort of a pop type album. I mean, for him, he was he talked about wanting an album that would sound, where the songs would sound really good in a live environment. And he would also talk about how he tried to, maybe not in the same kind of direct way you would get from like the more sort of punk bands like the Clash, but to, address maybe, some social considerations and so on. So it wasn't necessarily a pop focused album. Again, it's an album that probably sold well in spite of that. Probably had quite a few people who bought it thinking, what the hell? I'm sure there was, some buyer's remorse, probably quite a few, copies found their way into the used bins of the burgeoning CD store market in the late 80s. But it was, it's funny, Bowie himself, kind of like with Tonight, it's an album that sort of retrospectively, he kind of tried to disown a bit. He would it was maybe a little more kind of measured than the way he would talk about Tonight. He would sort of concede, well, I had good songs on it, but I didn't do them as well as I should. And, he would sort of talk, like when, you'd hear, again, mostly secondhand, because it would be, it would be some of his later collaborators, people like Reeves Gabrels he would say, yeah, I had good songs, but I wasn't like as involved in recording them as I should have been. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I see stuff like that. And I think, yeah, it kind of seems like revisionist history to me, because it seemed like, he still wrote all those songs. Like Let's Dance has, a number of, like, for example, has a number of songs that were cover versions, or maybe, things that he had written with other people. Same with Tonight. On Never Let Me Down, the only song that wasn't like a newly written, or in some cases co-written, Bowie song was, one Iggy Pop cover. So 10 out of 11 songs in Never Let Me Down were new compositions. So he was clearly somewhat engaged with this record,
Sure.
So I think he was still not quite sure what he wanted to do. I think that and look, I'm always I'm loath to kind of, do dime store psychology on someone I've never met. but I do think sometimes that maybe he was torn, that he knew he kind of wanted to go back into maybe some edgier sounds, but he also was maybe not sure if he wanted to go, when he was doing Never Let Me Down, whether he wanted to go sort of all in the way he would do a couple years later with Tin Machine. So maybe what people respond to, or I should say don't respond to, is that maybe that album felt a little bit neither fish nor fowl, like that maybe it just didn't go far enough into that kind of more aggressive rock oriented space.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
During our brief intermission, let's take a flying trip from the land of fantasy to everyday life.
Don Klees is our guest. He's got a new book out, part of Sonicbond Publishing's On Track series. It's called David Bowie, 1983 to 2016. Every album, every song. So Tin Machine era, 1988 to 1992. 2 albums. By the way, I was a little bummed. The second album is not on Spotify. The first one is.
Yeah, there's some weirdness with, Tin Machine in general, but that second album in particular. Like they did a vinyl reissue, I think, a couple years ago. But something with the songs I've heard, but never kind of fully got the story of it, that there's maybe some dispute with the Sales brothers, Hunt and Tony Sales, who were the drummer and bass player in Tin Machine, like questions about whether Tin Machine was, properly speaking, a band in which they had sort of an equal say versus them just being sort of hired musicians. And then maybe that's got something to do with it. Again, like so many things with Bowie, it's like there's a lot of conflicting stories, and I don't want to, again, I never want to be too gossipy about those things, but yeah, there's I feel like there's some strange stuff with the rights to that one in particular. Maybe less so with the first album, because when Bowie did Let's Dance, that was the first of what was supposed to be a 5-album deal with EMI Records. The first Tin Machine album ended up being the 4th and final one, because EMI was like, no, I think we're done now, after they got it that some people felt sounded more reminiscent of Sonic Youth than anything else.
Right. Kevin Armstrong, who played guitars and keys on, I think, both albums, he was on this show. He was on this podcast over a year ago. He had a great book out.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get that one. He's kind of an undersung hero. He was part of the Live Aid band as well. And
yes, he talks about it in the book.
Yeah, he was, again, he probably should have been like made an official member of the band. I'm not sure exactly what kind of went into that. I don't know if Bo was just worried about, maybe he felt the environment was already like ready to, kind of implode on itself between, because he had started, after the Glass Spider tour, and after, he was, by most accounts, not hugely happy with it. I saw the tour, by the way. I saw the Glass Spider tour, by the way. It's the first of 4 times I got to see Bowie live. I enjoyed it. Yeah, it was kind of ridiculous. It was kind of crazy.
Was it mostly a greatest hits kind of a tour?
No. It was. That's the thing about it. It was. He did a lot of the most popular stuff. Don't get me wrong. He did, and including, I will say, another great version of Heroes, for that matter. The staging of which was one of the staging that went into it with all the dancers and everything else. The staging was kind of weird and very uneven in spots. But I will say the staging did for Heroes, which I won't even attempt to describe here. But if you can find the concert video like online somewhere, hopefully legally, it was, I have to say, pretty cool. But he really did bring in, like, he did a lot of current stuff from Never Let Me Down, a lot of recent hits, a lot of very well established songs, Fashion, Scary Monsters, and so on, Rebel Rebel. But he also threw in some real curveballs in the set, stuff like the song All the Madmen, which was a song from The Man Who Sold the World. A greatest hit it is not. It's a fantastic song, but anything but a greatest hit. So he was definitely, willing to put in these unconventional songs in the set. But again, I think that, the staging, I think, put off a lot of people. It didn't help that it was a stadium show in the summer where, like, it's not getting dark until well into the show. You're having trouble seeing what's going on. Like it was, I think, and as some of the people who performed on the tour said, probably the kind of show that should have been done in a kind of a arena setting rather than an outdoor stadium one. Might have landed better, but anyway, he was kind of, I think he was not sure what to do next, and he had kind of a chance meeting with a guitarist named Reeves Gabrels, whose wife had been one of the publicists for the tour, and that Bowie had spent some time with. Although interestingly, Bowie did not find out until like after the tour that Reeves Gabrels was even a guitarist, and so I guess his wife had kind of snuck her husband's demo to him, and after he heard it, he said, he was kind of looking for someone. I think he was looking for a spark, in the simplest terms. And so he invited Gabrels to come, try to, record with him, write songs with him. And that ultimately kind of is what led to the Tin Machine project. Because I think Gabrels basically said, Gabrels sort of confronted Bowie, and this is in the guitarist's telling of it, with the fact that his deal with EMI meant that they had to basically put out whatever album Bowie recorded for them. And so he said, make an album that you feel good about. Don't worry about if it's going to sell. Make the album you want to make, and then, see what happens from there. Bowie, I think, Bowie seemed to delight in curveballs. He brought in the Sales Brothers, who they had been part of the band when he recorded stuff with Iggy Pop in the 70s. They had performed with like Todd Rundgren, I think, in the early 70s. So they were, the Hunt and Tony Sales were established musicians. They were kind of from a showbiz family. Their father, Soupy Sales, a very famous comedian.
I didn't know that. Soupy Sales?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So, and by all accounts, Hunt and Tony Sales were also kind of batshit crazy. And so, so basically this whole situation, it became a band situation. It went from a David Bowie album that Gabrels would be playing on to this band situation. And, I think they at least tried to kind of present some semblance of democracy there. Like, for instance, reputedly Bowie would refuse to do any solo interviews about the band. He would always insist, nope, we're a band. You either interview us all or you don't interview any of us. And, I think the purpose of it, I think with Bowie, there's probably always multiple things going on. I think some of it was he wanted to do a loud, noisy rock album. I think because he'd been listening to bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth and so on. And I think he wanted to kind of channel that a bit. I think he also liked the idea of sort of laying low a bit. So they did this album, and it's a good album. The two Tin Machine albums, I think both of them are kind of uneven. I think there's one really fantastic album between them. Like if you look for best songs, if you take Prisoner of Love and Under the God from the first album and Shopping for Girls and Baby Universal from the second and a bunch of other songs, and you ditch stuff like Crack City and Stateside, you're going to end up with a really good album.
Adrian Belew said that he should have inserted more of melodic content in there. Bowie's former guitarist.
I think that's an on-point comment from Adrian Belew, who's a fantastic musician, who's worked with obviously a ton of people and all that, and worked with Bowie a fair amount. But I think one of the aspects in that too, though, is that I think Bowie is often at his best where the music has sort of I guess what I would just call a sense of drama to it. Like not that the song is sort of inherently narrative or anything like that, but just that you sort of feel, again, that sort of dramatic aspect to it. And I think the best of the Tin Machine songs are, things like Prisoner of Love or, again, Shopping for Girls, where you just sort of feel that, that aspect to it, that conflict or whatever. And others are just, maybe just the lackluster ones, maybe just don't have that sort of animating force to them.
Actually, the greatest hits tour that I was referring to was the Sound and Vision tour.
Oh, sorry.
That was my bad there. So that was the one, because that was in between the two albums.
Right.
And that was essentially, maybe David had an underlying plan with that tour. Like maybe he was saying goodbye to that part of his career and letting his fans know that's all behind me.
That was his intention, or at least it was, he wanted to give himself that option, What I've read points to the Sound and Vision tour having been planned before he even recorded the first Tin Machine album. So I think the fact that it was sort of a case of he was committed to it, so he was going to do it anyway. He apparently asked Reeves Gabrels if he wanted to join the tour. Gabrel said, "No, I kind of feel like I'm part of your now, not part of your history." And so he kind of politely declined. And that's where Adrian Belew came in, because, because Belew had played on, he played on the album Lodger. He had toured with Bowie in the late 70s, like after the release of Heroes. And so I think there was a sense of, it was good to have an artist with Bowie who maybe, again, or, had that kind of connection with at least a good chunk of his musical background. But when you look at these artists like Bowie, who you're getting to like late 80s and 90s, I mean, some of these people, they've been around from the 60s. They have these careers that are well over 20 years by now, which of course I don't think anyone expected by then. And you're at that point where it's like your original fans are maybe bringing their kids to your shows and you're telling them about all these great songs. Like, I think, for instance, I saw the Sound and Vision tour, and then I think it was 5 days later, I saw Paul McCartney, at his tour after that. McCartney's show, heavy on the Beatles, a lot of, all, kind of very hit heavy. I think Bowie was maybe like ambivalent about the idea of having to sort of play all those hits, because I think he realized, hey, if I play all these hits, then that doesn't leave a lot of room for new stuff. Again, you look at the Rolling Stones, and this is not to knock any of these people. I mean, I'm not saying that, but if you go to a Rolling Stones show, other than maybe some songs from the latest album, can pretty much guarantee you their set list ends with Tattoo You. I don't think Bowie wanted that. I don't think he wanted to be sort of circumscribed by the sort of classic rock version of his work. I think he wanted to have the freedom to do kind of whatever he wanted. So I think this was sort of his bargain with the audience, saying, look, I'll play all the songs you love, all the big hits you love. And after this, no promises. Maybe I'll play them again. Maybe I won't. But I think it was his way of sort of kind of being fair to his audience, saying, look, I don't want to be doing these songs forever, but I also know you love to hear them. So let's find a compromise.
Let's talk post Tin Machine.
Tin Machine is one of those things too, where again, you can I think if you ask 5 people kind of within Bowie's orbit, what happened with Tin Machine, you'll probably get 6 different answers. But I guess whatever else happened, I think what's striking is, Bowie apparently said, look, I want to keep working with you. And they did, again, Gabrels was with him basically through the 1990s. The first album that Bowie did under his own name after Tin Machine was called Black Tie, White Noise. And it's kind of a strange album, because it was an album where he worked with Nile Rodgers again. But much to Rodgers' frustration, Bowie was not necessarily, he was sort of just absolutely going out of his way to sort of, he didn't want to make Let's Dance Part 2, no matter how much Rodgers begged him to kind of do otherwise. But it's an album that was very, just showed a lot of just the different musical styles that Bowie had kind of indulged in, over the years. It
was also a tough period for all those artists. There was grunge was the big thing.
Yeah. And he
1993 really is when it came out.
Yeah. And Bowie, he really did go kind of the other way around. But, and you can hear just a lot of different aspects. I mean, definitely Bowie's sort of jazz inclinations are in there in various places. I mean, it was the first album he had done with multiple instrumentals, certainly in many years. And again, Gabrels appeared on one of the songs, a song actually I think they wrote together called You've Been Around. Then you also have this very sort of almost very dark, sort of dystopian sounding song called Jump, They Say, which didn't really make much of an impression in the US, but was a big hit in the UK. He covered a Morrissey song, which apparently was a Morrissey song. It was a Morrissey song that had been on an album of Morrissey that was produced by Bowie's former collaborator, Mick Ronson. And so there was it was kind of like it was some reverse DNA transcription here or something, But yeah, it was, I think it was an album where Bowie, I think, was still kind of, finding himself, exploring a lot of different things that he had, the styles and approaches that he enjoyed doing. Again, in the US, unfortunately, the record company that released it went bankrupt. So it kind of stopped short in the US, did fairly well in the UK though.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
I think you'd be glad later if you weren't here now.
There is another album he made that released that year, 93, you say is the ultimate cult favorite David Bowie album. That's the Buddha of Suburbia.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Buddha of Suburbia was a book written by a guy named Hanif Kureishi, whose name I hope I've pronounced correctly. Should have checked that. And I apologize if I got it wrong to any friends or family listening. But he was a writer who he wrote screenplays to a number of well-regarded movies in the 80s, My Beautiful Laundrette being maybe the most famous of them. And he wrote this novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, that was about this kind of young man kind of coming to grips with his identity and kind of that early 70s time period. And it was adapted as a miniseries for the BBC. He had hoped that because Bowie had been sort of a big influence on him, he had hoped to get Bowie's permission to use some of his songs in the miniseries. And Bowie sort of did one better. He said, I'll provide the soundtrack for it. Like, I'll write new stuff for it. And so he did, because, the BBC is a publicly funded broadcaster in the UK. So their budgets were, maybe not the biggest. So Bowie's like, well, I didn't get paid a lot of money to do this music, but I'm going to turn it into a record of my own and, get a little money back for it. So he did this. He worked with a musician named Erdal Kazilke, who had done a lot of work with him in the 80s. He had performed on Never Let Me Down, as well as a number of the soundtrack recordings he did in the 80s. And was a super versatile musician, could basically play anything, trumpet, bass guitar, whatever, he could do it. So Bowie did this album, and I think because the story had this kind of early 70s setting and kind of coinciding with Bowie himself, but with his sort of rise to stardom, I think it kind of put Bowie maybe in this sort of, I don't know, it's more reflective mode. Again, I always feel ambivalent about any kind of psychology here, especially with someone like David Bowie. But you definitely throughout the album, like in the title song, you hear a lot of references, both musical and lyrical, to other Bowie tracks, and you also hear across the songs on the album, which were recorded in a very kind of atypical, kind of improvisational style. You also hear a lot of the kind of experimentation that he would do in some of his work with Brian Eno in the kind of late 70s. So I think it was an album where he really kind of re-engaged with his past in both kind of like thematically and musically. And the record itself, because it wasn't quite a new Bowie album, but it wasn't sort of I think with a soundtrack album the way we think of a soundtrack album, chock-a-block with hits and everything. It kind of initially sort of fell between the cracks, and like it wasn't even officially released in the US until years later. So it was this album that I think, a lot of people just maybe didn't even realize had happened. But when you hear it, it does almost have that kind of, you want to say kind of missing link quality to it, that you realize that here he was, again, trying all these really interesting and different approaches, coming up with some really terrific songs. The title track, Buddha of Suburbia, is, I think, is certainly one of the best things he did in the 90s. And, there's some other great songs on it, like Strangers When We Meet. It's, again, it never, it didn't top the charts by any stretch, but it's just a really fascinating piece of work. And,
you got me interested. I want to hear the whole album now.
It's worth seeking out. I mean, I think it's probably on Spotify.
It is, yeah.
There's a couple of the tracks, the instrumental ones, if I'm being honest, don't develop their sort of central kind of musical theme as much as they could. But again, some of the tracks are I think really cool. Yeah,
I got the title track as part of the playlist for this episode, but I'll check out the rest of it. I'm Afraid of Americans from 1995's Outside. That's one of my all-time favorite Bowie songs, and quite a history to this. So there's 6 different versions that were released.
Oh, well, I mean, if to be honest, even slightly more when you get down to it, because it's funny because like the history, it's got one of the kind of windier histories of just about any Bowie song that I can think of.
Yeah, long gestation period.
Yeah. Well, like, because it,
like he wrote in the book.
well, it goes back at least as far, and I say at least because, again, there's only, I tried to be in this book, I tried to kind of really be sort of, I don't know, like Sergeant Joe Friday and Dragnet, just the facts, man.
Yeah.
But as much as possible. But in the case of this song, I mean, its roots go back to at least as far back as January of 1995, because at that point it was known under various alternate titles, one of which was Dummy, one of which Johnny Downloader, because at one point it was envisioned as maybe that it could have been the title song to the Keanu Reeves movie Johnny Mnemonic, the kind of cyberpunk movie that from like 95, I think it was, but that didn't come to pass. The version that was basically, that Bowie worked on with Brian Eno, that was kind of during some of the sessions for the album Outside, became it was featured on the infamously bad soundtrack, the infamously bad movie Showgirls. And then when Bowie was doing the album Earthling, in kind of after that, Bowie and his band at the time, Reeves Gabrels, Gail Ann Dorsey, and Mark Plotty, they re-recorded it for the album Earthling. But then, even after that, Bowie asked Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, who he had toured with in '95. I think I'm also, in the same way that I was one of 10 people maybe to see Last Invitation of Christ in the theaters, I think I was also one of 10 people who went to see the tour that Bowie did with Nine Inch Nails in 1995 that was actually there wanting to see both Nine Inch Nails and David Bowie. Like,
yeah, right,
yeah.
right.
So,
two different generations there.
Right. I think I was like right in just the right point to be interested in both.
Yep.
But Bowie, Bowie asked Reznor to basically take what I've done here with this song, all the different, the tracks that existed, and basically, have at it. So that led to, again, we're already sort of multiple versions in here, including some which have only been like kind of released after the fact, but that adds 6 more versions to it. Some of which are not super different from each other, if we're being honest, but like one of which features Ice Cube on it. Some which are like really kind of going more into the atmospheric side of it. I think the one that's called V1, as they call it, which is the one you heard on the radio that the music video was set to. I mean, that's the one that, I think is probably the sort of, I guess if you're going to call any of them the quintessential version, that's the one.
That's the one.
Yeah. But yeah, it's and for Bowie's part, it's a very, very kind of atypically direct song from him. And I think he's always, again, when you've seen interviews from it, he always says, like, I'm not, knocking Americans. Look, this is a guy who, lived very happily in New York for, last couple decades of his life. He's always sort of talked about that it was really meant to be a more sardonic exploration of that sort of, the cliche version of American culture, the over McDonald's, Disney, cultural hegemony approach to it. Not, I think he, again, I mean, by all indications, he really loved living in New York and that environment. So I don't think I think he was, again, I don't think he was deliberately trying to piss anyone off.
No, didn't get that feeling either. You lead the chapter on the 2000 album Toy by writing, quote, where David Bowie's 1980s work was characterized by diverging from previous artistic collaborators, his records in the 1990s found him reconnecting with many of those individuals. The resulting albums didn't necessarily match their predecessors, but they succeeded in reestablishing Bowie as a creatively restless figure. And then you section.
Did I say that?
You did. That was you wrote it. You section off 3 albums in the chapter titled A Better Future, ? 2000's Toy, 2002's Heathen, 2003's Reality. Now explain that title, A Better Future, and your thoughts on Bowie's start to the new decade.
Yeah, to kind of clarify, it's like you always worry sometimes when you write these things, like, oh my God, am I being a little too pretentious here? And yeah, I think like, in the 80s, Bowie, like, again, when he doing the album, doing Let's Dance with Nile Rodgers, like that was almost all new people on that album. Like off the top of my head, I don't think any of the musicians on Let's Dance were people that Bowie had worked with before. So I think it was, it was a little bit of a fresh start. And I think as you get into the 90s and he started working again with people like Mike Garson, who had been part of his band going back to even sort of part of the Ziggy period in the 70s, I think it was, again, I think in the 90s, there was that element of again, I think reconnecting with the people who had been part of his life and his work. Again, even as he was still working with people who were brand new to him, like the bass player and singer Gail Ann Dorsey, who was just a tremendous contributor to some of his later albums. And when you hear his work with those people and the band that he kind of put together around him, that kind of, I almost want to say like a repertory company of musicians that he had, after Reeves Gabrels and he and Bowie kind of parted ways musically, you had people again like Gail Ann Dorsey, you had the guitarist Earl Slick kind of come back in to sort of take that, kind of take that lead guitar space again. And, he had just developed this, this terrific band around him who could, I mean, and again, Mike Garson is the piano player. I mean, they could do all the old songs. I guarantee you, if Bowie had asked them to do anything from his back catalog, they would have come up with a fantastic arrangement of it. And I think that's kind of what led to Bowie doing the album, wanting to do the album Toy, which wasn't released till, after his death. But, there was really recording a lot of his sort of pre-Stardom songs. And that I think kind of capped off that, again, we only sort of appreciate it in hindsight, but it kind of capped off that 1990s period of sort of coming back into his own as an artist a bit, calling that period and that kind of early 2000s period, using that umbrella chapter title, A Better Future. I think it points to a couple of things. I mean, one was the fact that he was really, on album, particularly on the album Heathen, he was really kind of grappling with a lot of the big, deep questions that that you do when you're, when you're in your 50s and you recognize that you're getting older. And, he talked about, how he trying to make sense of the world that his daughter was born into. His daughter, Lexi was born in 2000, and, she was coming of age post 9/11 in New York. And I think those elements surely weighed on him. I mean, he was, I guess he was luckier than most because he had this amazing outlet for those concerns that, a lot of us, don't get to have. So again, he's sort of considering this idea of a better future for his family, for himself, for everyone, against the backdrop of obviously troubling times. But I suppose also, in the title, I guess I'm also kind of highlighting the fact that as he kind of explored these troubling times, his musical future had never been brighter. But then you flip the script again, and that heart attack in June of 2004 kind of cut that future short in a way.
Which the book finishes out with 04 to 2017's No Plan. Yeah. Right up, that was the album after he passed. But nobody saw his death coming in January of 2016. He kept that hidden, didn't he?
He really did, and he was very circumspect. I mean, he definitely confided in Tony Visconti, Visconti had been one of his main production partners in the 70s. Like on the Berlin trilogy. A lot of people assume he produced the albums like Low and Heroes with Brian Eno. Actually, it was Tony Visconti, and Visconti and Bowie kind of reunited, kind of in earnest for Heathen, and then they did Reality together. And 2013, when Bowie decided he wanted to get back into music, there was Visconti again. And as they were getting ready,
the next day is 2013.
Yeah, next day. Sorry, yeah. When it came time to do the album that became Blackstar, Bowie confided in Visconti, and probably like he confided in very few others, about his cancer diagnosis, and that he was, had been getting treatment and everything. But apparently a lot of the musicians had no idea what was going on. And there had been rumors about Bowie's health for many years. I mean, he was sort of perpetually, there had been just a series of rumors about what was going on. I suppose ironically in this case, the rumors were at least somewhat true.
But appearances, he always looked youthful. To
me,
he always looked so he was going to be the guy that's going to be around till he's 100.
It's ironic of all the, he very famously appeared in the Elephant Man on Broadway in the early 80s. I would say if there was any show he should have been in, it should have been The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah,
he had that element to him. But yeah, so it did come Yeah, I mean, when I heard the news, it, I mean, I practically fell out of bed. I mean, it was shocking, and shocking in part because, of course, Blackstar came out January 8th, 2016. So it was his 69th birthday.
Yeah.
And man, I listened to that, I mean, I was listening to that album all that weekend. I mean, I remember I was listening to it when I was driving my kids to school, the day it came out.
Title track is brilliant.
Title track's fantastic. It's
I
mean, God only knows what it's about. I mean,
yeah,
that's
right.
It's it's, and that's it's a funny thing. You heard very little publicly from Bowie in kind of those later years, but one notable exception was at one point Donnie McCaslin, who was the saxophone player, who was kind of the core of musicians for recording Blackstar. He said, I think it was in Rolling Stone, that Bowie told him that the song was somehow about ISIS, the Islamic State. But then apparently Bowie's team, through a spokesperson, said, no, that is not what it's about. It's not about the Middle East. But, Tony Visconti has said, oh, I don't know what it's about. Like he's also sort of said that he figured Bowie probably liked it that way. He probably liked that the song is kind of inscrutable.
Sure. Yeah. And there was the thought that he knew he was dying and he wanted this to be his final act. That wasn't so. Visconti said that he planned on continuing this.
Yeah, well, I think
he passed 2 days after the release of the album, 2 days after his birthday.
Yeah. It seems pretty clear, and Visconti has said this in comments. And look, Visconti kind of became the latter day sort of voice for Bowie on kind of musical matters, like, because Bowie just, again, at a certain point, he just stopped giving interviews and so on. But Visconti, who was obviously intimately involved in making these final records, would comment, and presumably with Bowie's blessing on them. And he talked about, shortly after Bowie's death, Visconti, talked about how Bowie clearly knew this could be his last record. I mean, when you're talking about cancer, obviously you got to be aware of that possibility. But he also recounted talking to Bowie very shortly before Blackstar came out, and he recalls Bowie being hopeful, and he was still working on music. So I mean, not to take anything away from the achievement, and certainly it's very easy to kind of look at things and think, wow, it does certainly look like someone planned this beautifully. But at the end of the day, when you look at it also in the context, you go back to Heathen from 2002, and that's an album that's also very, again, it's preoccupied with a lot of those questions of mortality are just as prevalent in those albums that came before too. So, I mean, he was really, I think he was working in that space, musically, mentally, emotionally, whatever. So it's not surprising that Blackstar would have that feel to it.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Are you listening? Now don't go away, ladies and gentlemen. We'll soon be with you.
So there was a posthumous release called No Plan in 2017, which were original songs for his off-Broadway musical Lazarus. And then you follow with a look at Bowie's compilations, his live albums. So you really cover it all here. What can you say about David Bowie that I guess hasn't been said, or your final thoughts on his body of work, which spanned close to 55 years, 26 studio albums?
It is such an amazing body of work that it's like, trying to do it justice. And look, I think this whole book was, I think, me trying to do justice, trying to be, again, it's one fan's perspective, but I think trying to do justice to a body of work that has just been a part of my life. I mean, if my copies of these albums disappeared tomorrow, they'd still, I think these songs would still be a part of me. And I think I'd still, my mind would have been kind of better off for having had them. But I was thinking though about, there was a story though that I think, to me, just sort of, I think it's just like the coolest story about Bowie. And it was in another, after that BBC documentary I mentioned, 5 years, there was one that focused on the last few years of his life and his work, called appropriately The Last 5 Years. And one of the people they interview is this jazz musician named Maria Schneider. And one of the songs that appeared on Blackstar was a song called Sue, in a Season of Crime, had an earlier version that appeared on one of Bowie's compilations. And Bowie did it with this woman, Maria Schneider's ensemble. And when it came time to do Blackstar, she and her group were too busy to do it. But so she suggested that Bowie talk to the saxophonist Donnie McCaslin, who, again, it was his group. McCaslin had performed on the original version of Sue, and he had his own group. And Schneider said to Bowie, you should talk to him because I think you should record it with his group. And she recounts Bowie asking her, do you think he'd want to work with me? And it's like, and so again, and so you think this guy who's, acclaimed in jazz circles, no question, but jazz obviously is not the kind of popular force in music that it once was, and which is unfortunate in many ways. I would consider I'm a jazz fan, so that's unfortunate that it's maybe not as well known. But I from the first time I saw that bit of interview, and the idea that this man, this artist who had accomplished so much, would have that reaction, that he would think, oh, would that person want to work with me? I think it just shows you that he really didn't take anything for granted, artistically speaking. That he didn't think, well, just because I'm David Bowie, that of course everyone's going to want to work with me. And you can definitely find examples of that kind of, throughout his career. We talked about the Buddha of Suburbia a little bit. And, the initial music that Bowie came up with, the folks making that miniseries, The Buddha of Suburbia, said, yeah, it doesn't really fit. And so, and again, someone of his stature, even if maybe he wasn't kind of at the top of his game back then and top of his status, he could have said, look, this is what I did. If you don't want it, that's fine. But he didn't do that. He went back and he worked at it some more and came up with something that fit better. Again, kind of whether he was sort of on top, down, a bit down, whatever, it seems like he was always pushing himself, and just, again, he didn't take anything for granted. And that to me seems to be like the most striking and maybe valuable thing that you could say about any artist and their achievements.
David Bowie, 1983 to 2016, every album, every song. It is out now in the UK through burningshed.com. In the US, you can get it through Amazon and wherever books are sold. And if you have a local bookstore, look for it there. And if it's not there, ask them to get a copy in store, and you can find your local bookstore through the bookedonrock.com website. And where can people find you online, Don, if they want to reach out to you?
I know it's not cool these days, but I probably on Facebook more than any other social platform. I don't really have time for that single letter one. I won't get into the politics of that. But
yeah.
I don't mind Instagram, though. I'm probably too verbose on balance for Instagram, but I am on Instagram at DP Klees. That's Klees. Again, just Don Klees on Facebook. I ran into someone once who I'd met in passing, and I reintroduced myself, and they said, I remember you from Facebook. And I remember thinking, yeah, no one ever forgets me from Facebook. So.
Yeah. Well, I've had my eyes on the Fleetwood Mac book and the Dylan book, because I've seen it in that Sonicbond catalog. So I'd love to have you kind of talk about those too. Those would be fun to talk about.
I'd love
as well.
to. Yeah. Again, I'm not approaching any of this from a contrarian standpoint. Again, like for the Dylan one, for example, the mid 1980s, that is when I became a fan. Again, I was aware of him, don't get me wrong, but I remember seeing the video for the song Joker Man, and I was like, and I had never seen or heard the like, not really. And, and so I think, doing that book, which that came out, I guess it's been
years ago.
It's been over 3 years now. And for me, it was about kind of getting to the heart of my fandom, because look, I know intellectually, my head knows these albums are not particularly respected. I can even say, yeah, I understand why not in many cases, but I also wanted to go into them with an open mind and open ears and see the virtues where they were there and acknowledge the shortcomings, of course. But I think that sometimes with Dylan in particular, I actually had, there's a certain writer about Bob Dylan who, when I would, and I'm not going to name the name, but whenever I would read their stuff about him, they always seemed to be so hyper focused on all the songs they left off and this alternate version and that alternate version. And they never seemed to want to talk about the album as it was. And I thought, well, for heaven's sake, do we have to go down all these what if rabbit holes of, like, okay, maybe we live in a multiverse, maybe not, but we don't have to pretend we do for the sake of talking about this amazing artist. Like, sometimes let's just talk about what's out there. Let's say he wanted to release, he wanted Infidels to have these 8 songs on them. Well,
I like Infidels. Yeah.
Yeah. As do I.
And No Mercy.
And again, my unpopular Dylan opinion, I don't happen to think Blind Willie McTell not being on the album really like somehow is some mortal wound to the record.
That is a big one, right? Yeah. And then it ended up years later on a box set.
Absolutely. But, I think, and particularly, it was that period, because I'm covering the 80s, I'm coming in right in the middle of the born again gospel period, and which is not the most beloved, to say the least. But, that was one I came away thinking, look, I certainly don't love every song here. And, Saved is never going to be my favorite Bob Dylan album. I'll tell you that for nothing. But I also came away with it thinking that these were deeply felt albums. And every album, and it's really 201, you name any Dylan album for that period, and I will tell you a genuinely terrific track from it, because that's just how it works. Again, his most consistent period. No, one of his most interesting, though, I've got to say. And so, yeah, I would love to talk about that. Fleetwood Mac. Look, the thing with Fleetwood Mac is, who do you believe? Who do you believe about what story? And that was tricky because, you want to recognize that, yeah, Lindsey Buckingham was not probably a good person to be around in a lot of cases. He was also the person who kind of, carried the band on his shoulders for the album Tango in the Night. So, and I
love that album too.
Yeah, it's again, I'm trying to be, trying to be, fair in mind. And look, again, I think Stevie Nicks booting him from the band as she did in 2018. I think that was monumentally uncool. But you know what? At the same time, I can also look at some of the criticism that Stevie Nicks received for some of her songs, in the 80s and say, hold on a second. That's just bullshit. Like that, like stuff is just nasty. Like not even criticizing the song on its merits, but but we can just sort of tell this is like some of the things just felt personal. And you think, so I'm not someone who could just write about any given artist. Like I think I went into those books with, I think, a sense of purpose is maybe the best way to put it. Because of just my love of that time, maybe feeling that some of these periods were underrated or whatever it was. And because I think I needed to, because if I'm going to spend months to a year or more, or almost 2 years in the Bowie case, I better be feeling it.
Yeah, well, congrats on the Bowie book, and I look forward to reading the other two, and we'll have you back on to discuss those 2 other books. That'd be interesting to get a deep dive into those. So, Don Klees, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's so great. You know, I'm happy to say, you know, I've got the book in hand. It's amazing to have it be real and to get to talk to someone about it and really just have a great conversation about it. I appreciate you making the time for me.
That's it. It's in the books.